Thank you. It's great to be here. As Bhaskar mentioned, I cover foreign policy, which if you do that under or in a world in which Donald Trump exists, it means that every day brings new absurdities. There's Russian hacking, of course. There's his Twitter account. There's golden showers at the Ritz-Carlton. Which, by the way, that's probably the first time that phrase has ever been uttered in the Lincoln Theater in its history. There's a lot of bluster. There's a lot of bluster in what he says, okay? But if you actually pay attention to what Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail, he was actually quite consistent. If you cut past all the bluster and the idiocy and the stupidity, there's actually a consistent message there, which is that Donald Trump says he's going to shift to an America First policy, which means getting rid of America's foreign entanglements. He was actually quite critical of the Iraq War. He's been called in the media an isolationist president. And you can understand why that might appeal to people, particularly in some of the devastated working class communities in this country, places that had once voted for Obama and then went to Trump, like in the Rust Belt. You can understand why that might appeal, the idea of an isolationist president. Because, for example, right now the United States is at war in Afghanistan. It is year number 15 of this war. That makes it the longest war in American history. A single airstrike today in Afghanistan cost about $500,000. A single airstrike. And yet here we're told that we don't have enough money for social services. A single year of the Afghan war cost $55 billion. $55 billion, and we're told we don't have enough money for public education. Lockheed Martin is developing the F-35 fighter jet, and it's charging the US government $1.4 trillion to do so. Okay, that's $1.4 trillion to develop a jet, and we're told we don't have enough money for health care. And just by comparison, the entire Medicaid and Medicare budget last year was $1.2 trillion. Exactly. Exactly. But you know, the thing is, you don't have to be a progressive to say that. For those of you who didn't hear, he said, fuck that. You don't have to be a progressive to say that. I think there's it's a widespread sentiment, even if you don't have that exact analysis, it's a widespread sentiment that there's something deeply wrong with America's role in the world, with the fact that it's been fighting 2 wars without an end in sight, costing billions of dollars and thousands of lives. But the truth is, despite that, Donald Trump is not an isolationist. Donald Trump's policy is America first, but his America is an America of CEOs. And I suspect, I would predict that we're going to continue to see foreign entanglements, foreign interventions, the drone war, everything that we've been used to. I think we're going to continue to see that, okay? At the same time, Donald Trump does represent something new in the foreign policy establishment. So what I want to talk about today is what Trump represents and how we might be able to fight him. But to understand what Trump represents, we actually have to understand what it is when we say the foreign policy establishment. What is the foreign policy establishment? What is that? And another way of thinking about this is there's a status quo in this country, and that's the way foreign policy is talked about. So what is that status quo? And so let's take a step back. Let's go back. Let's take the issue of foreign intervention. Okay, going back 40 years. The United States lost the war in Vietnam, lost it spectacularly. And after it lost the war, the ability of the US to intervene in other countries to overthrow sovereign states was greatly constrained because of the way it lost the war. So the next 2 presidents, that's Carter and Reagan, they actually shifted away from open interventions towards indirect interventions, towards proxy wars. That, for example, was the war in Afghanistan that the US funded the Mujahideen. It was also the wars in Central America. In the 1990s, George Bush and especially Bill Clinton tried to rehabilitate the idea of foreign intervention, of being able to go and intervene in countries and change the leaderships. It was done under the guise of humanitarian intervention. But it really took 9/11 for the US to once again openly invade countries and depose the states, and of course Iraq and Afghanistan. But like Vietnam, those two wars failed spectacularly. So when Obama was elected, he shifted the pendulum back again, back towards proxy wars, back towards indirect interventions. So for example, under Obama's rule in Afghanistan, the number of militias, informal militias that are armed and paid by the US government increased exponentially, to the point where today there's about, give or take, 100,000 men, armed men, who are being paid for by the US state. Well, yes, we need to stop funding it, but the problem is that there's been a consensus on both sides of the aisle, from Democrats and Republicans. There's been a fundamental consensus, in fact, over the last 40 years, of the basic features of American power. That is, that the United States has a right to intervene where it wants, when it wants, even if that means militarily, even if that means overthrowing sovereign states. This has been a consensus, and when I say the foreign policy establishment, I mean that consensus. That is a consensus that has not been challenged by anybody in the two major parties. And what does that consensus look like? Well, if you look around the globe, there are 800 military bases, US bases, in 70 countries. The US has the largest nuclear stockpile that's ever been assembled. The US defense budget is greater than the next 8 countries combined. And if we're going to be honest and describe what that is, that's an empire. That's an empire that's probably the greatest empire that this planet has ever seen. And there's a remarkable consensus over the facts of that empire. And one of the things that drives this empire is to have spheres of influence. These days, especially after the end of the Cold War, the main reason for spheres of influence is for deregulation, for privatization, for the control of markets, to integrate areas into the American order. And I just want to read a quick quote from Jimmy Carter. This inaugurated what's now called the Carter Doctrine. This was something he said in 1979 after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. He said, "The region which is now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan is of great strategic importance. It contains more than 2/3 of the world's exportable oil. Any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America. And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." So the US decreed the Persian Gulf region as its sphere of influence, and any assault on that region would be met with force. The US is not the only country that has a sphere of influence that is building bases, et cetera. There are other countries that do this, Russia, China, et cetera. And there's competition between these major forces. And that competition is what drives American empire. It is what drives the building of all these bases, okay? So everything I've just described, that is the status quo foreign policy that both parties have agreed upon for the last 40 years. Donald Trump represents, to a degree, a departure from that. And the reason is because Donald Trump represents, to an unprecedented degree, the corruption of the American state. And this is what Naomi meant when we talked about a corporate coup, okay? These are businessmen who are using the state as a vehicle to further their personal business interests. Rex Tillerson, can I get a boo here? Thank you. Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, has been accused of having ties with Russia. Of course he has ties with Russia because he was a CEO of ExxonMobil. Now he's a Secretary of State at the head of a state that is the enemy of Russia. And these are some of the contradictions we see. But it's only by understanding the fact that the American state has become so corrupted that there's a clique of businessmen that have taken it and are using it for their immediate business interest instead of for the long-term geostrategic imperial interests of the American empire, that we can understand how it is that a state can oppose Russia, but the head of state can be friendly with Russia. Okay? The point, though, of all this, is to say that we are faced with two options, two choices. We are faced, on the one hand, with the foreign policy status quo, which is, in other words, empire as usual. And we're faced, on the other hand, with the crony capitalism of Donald Trump. And we need to resist both. We need to resist both empire and the crony capitalism. And I mentioned the word resistance because it's a word that's thrown around a lot these days. I was on the way here on the radio. I heard that one of the ways to resist, because Trump is attacking journalists, is to subscribe to the Washington Post. And so that's not resistance. So, and what does resistance look like? Part of it is something that we have to actually discover. There's new strategies that we have to figure out. But we should also not forget the lessons of people who resisted before us, who resisted successfully before us, okay? And when it comes to resisting militarism and empire, if you look at all the successful movements, they've all had three features in common. The first is that they were independent. The second is they're based on solidarity, and the third is they're based on popular struggles, grassroots struggles from below. Okay, so I'll describe very briefly what I mean by each of those three. On independence, it's an unfortunate fact that Donald Trump did not come from nowhere. The first systematic attempt to write laws that targeted Arabs and Muslims actually happened in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. There was something called the Secret Evidence Law, under which immigrants could be deported from this country on the basis of evidence which they could not see. This law was primarily targeted against Muslims or people from Muslim countries, and it was so hated in the American Muslim community that George Bush actually campaigned against it. And 80% of American Muslims voted for Bush in the 2000 election. Of course, after 9/11, Bush extended these same laws, expanded it, and introduced new ones, or new protocols such as NSEERS, which was the first systematic attempt to register people from Muslim countries. Okay, this is 15 years before any talk about registering Muslims. Okay, this is back in 2001, 2002. Along with NSEERS, he also very famously gutted civil liberties in the name of fighting the war on terror. It's only because he did those things and Clinton did those things before that when Barack Obama took power in 2008, that he was able to extend those laws and add new ones, such as the nationwide suspicious activities database, under which many, many people of Muslim or Arabs or Muslims were rounded up, were accused of ridiculous things. They were detained for things like taking selfies and whatnot. In addition to that, he expanded the national security state, expanded the drone program, and took the war on terror, which is Bush's policy, and made it into a permanent state of being. And it's only because of that, it's only because of all of those policies that came before, it's only because of the dog whistle politics around the questions of Islam, it's only because of institutionalizing Islamophobia by three administrations that we could come to a point in 2016 where a man can stand for president and openly call for banning Muslims. And so, we need to resist Trump, but we also need to resist a system that makes a Donald Trump possible. And that means allying with everybody who's on our side, but maintaining independence from the liberal establishment that aided and abetted this calamity from the very beginning. That's independence. I'd like to talk about the second point, which is solidarity. Now, I mentioned that the world is divided into spheres of influence. The United States isn't the only imperial power. There's Russia, there's China, and again, it's ordinary people who get caught in between these major powers. And that means that for solidarity, we should always have solidarity with people and never with states. So that means, for example, solidarity with the people of Bahrain, who last week and this week have been protesting a brutal dictatorship which is being backed by Saudi Arabia and the United States. It means solidarity with people in Yemen who've been suffering through an incredibly devastating war. A war that's killed 10,000 people with American-made bombs. And it means solidarity with the people of Syria who have been resisting people in Syria who've been resisting a genocidal dictator who is backed by Russian imperialism. So solidarity with people, never with states. And finally, I'm just going to end with the form that resistance should take, that I think, Donald Trump's slogan, as we all know, is "Make America Great Again." And I'm sure Kianga will probably talk about how for most people, most of the time, America was never really that great. Right? But look, it is undeniable that life in America was actually better in many respects, in many fundamental respects, a generation or two ago than it was today. Okay? Especially for some basic freedoms and civil liberties that have been steadily eroding over the last 3 or 4 decades. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and to thank those brave men and women who fought for our freedoms. These are freedoms that we tend to take for granted, but as the saying goes, freedom is not free. And these are people like Clara Lemick, who all the way back in 1909, together with 20,000 female garment workers, went on strike against sweatshop conditions. And launched a movement that eventually led to the end of sweatshop labor, so that people, generations after her, can enjoy the basic freedom of having humane work conditions. Or people like the activists in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, not just Rosa Parks, but all of the activists. A lot of people don't know that the bus boycott actually lasted for 381 days. Okay, 381 days just so black people could have the basic freedom of sitting where they chose on a bus. And the point of all this is that a single protest, as important as they are, a single protest has never changed anything, okay? But the social movements that link protest, that is the lifeblood of resistance. Okay. That is the only thing, ultimately, that's ever changed anything. And by that I mean civil disobedience, boycotts, sit-ins, prison solidarity networks, abortion funds, sanctuary spaces, all of it. All of it. Because resistance isn't a moment, resistance isn't a state of mind. Resistance is a tapestry which is collective and enduring. It's so enduring that the status quo cannot sleep at night. At the height of the Vietnam War, when LBJ was campaigning, every place that he went, every public appearance he made, there were protests and sit-ins, to the point where he couldn't make public appearances anymore. And it was in the context of a public opinion quickly turning against him, and he decided not to run for re-election. That is what resistance looks like, and that is what we need. Thank you.